I spoke with Christine Estima last fall when she came in to talk about her debut collection of stories, the Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society. It traces the story of an Arab family fleeing the Middle East and settling in Montreal. The upheaval of the 20th century was writ large in her characters' lives, and that's a period in history that fascinates Christine. She plans to set her next book in the period between the two world wars, and as a reader, she seeks out novels set in the early part of the 20th century. Christine is here now to share 3 of her favorite reads that take place in that era. Hi, Christine. Welcome back to The Next Chapter.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, what is it about the 20th century that you find so compelling?
The 20th century specifically, I think in the early half of it, is just loaded with so much upheaval and so much change. The 20th century is really interesting because so much advancement in society and technology happened within that one century, way more than in the 19 centuries that came before it. And so what you get is this really interesting pocket of time where we're starting to, lurch towards modernity, but there's still little bits of the old world society still peppering it, So you get people who are interested in machinery and automation, but they still have like top hats and watch fobs, and in terms of how society operated, in terms of the manners and norms and societal expectations, we have kind of lost some of that. And I find that period really interesting, specifically because we had 2 world wars. Almost back to back. And so those wars advanced, I think, society for better or for worse in a way that we hadn't seen in the 19 centuries before it.
All right. And that is the theme for the reading that you've been doing in the 3 books, the 3 novels that you've brought in today. So tell me about this first novel.
So the first book is The Tobacconist by Robert C. Toller. This is an incredible tome. It's not even that big, but it really packs a wallop. And this takes place in Vienna in the interwar period, so like the last golden days of the 1930s. And the Anschluss, which is the annexation of Austria, is about to happen when the book starts. And we follow this young boy, his name is Franz, and he comes from a small countryside town, and he needs to help his family earn money, so his mother sends him to go work at a tobacconist shop in Vienna. And that's another thing, do we even have tobacconist shops anymore? Now you just go to the corner store, a depenner, and you buy cigarettes or something, but a shop that just specializes in selling tobacco is just so quaint, and I just love it.
You're preaching to the choir on that. I love that.
Exactly, right? And then in the book, what happens is one of the clients that keeps showing up at the tobacconist is the Professor Sigmund Freud. And Franz falls in love with this young Czech girl that he meets in Vienna, and he keeps showing up at Freud's, office and asking him questions about love and life and how to deal with pain and loss and mourning and healing and hope. Meanwhile, Freud, who is Jewish, is being persecuted as the Anschluss happens and the Nazis take control of Austria and they annex it. And he is slowly dying of jaw cancer, and he knows he has to flee to England. And so amongst this kind of small story of this young boy, this country bumpkin in the big city, you also have a larger scene of a city that is about to be thrust into the epicenter of history. And Vienna is just a really interesting city if you're interested in kind of the microcosm of the 20th century kind of bursting forward in the early part, because Vienna was, the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which collapsed after the Great War in 1918. They were a destroyed city for those 20 years between the 2 wars. There were coal shortages and there was bread lines. People were starving. Women were selling their bodies. Men were coming home with hastily patched up faces and phantom limbs. And, you really kind of understand why it became this important catalyst for what was about to happen in Europe in the 40s.
It's very interesting. As you say, it's not a tome. It's a shorter book than you would think, given how rich all this subject matter is.
Absolutely.
But as you say, it looks like it packs a wallop. All right. What is next on your list today?
Next would be A History of Burning by Janika Oza. She's a Canadian author, and this is her debut novel, and this is an incredible story that I think is underreported a lot in history. I don't think a lot of people know about this story. It's about young Indians. It's a family and they were kind of tricked by, British colonialism into being sent over to Uganda and into Eastern Africa to build the railway lines there. You can track them through time. Like the story kind of starts in 1890 and follows them through the history in Eastern Africa and Uganda, where they are being ostracized and they are being used by first the British colonialists, and then later on when Idi Amin in the 1970s comes to power, and the way that they are again ostracized by the locals in Uganda, and the way that they have to consistently throughout their family history find a way to survive in a society that wasn't designed with them in mind.
I read this book in the fall, and I found it incredibly compelling, partly also because of my own family's connection to colonialism and also all the people I know who had to leave Africa in the 70s. Tell me how Janika Oza shows the fallout from all that history in the lives of her characters.
Yeah, it's kind of like a family trait that she writes about. Each family member almost has a kind of stoicism to them, like they take on a huge degree of pain and suffering that within their own lives. Like the very first character we meet, his name is Purbhai, and the only reason he wants to take on or he is tricked into traveling to, Eastern Africa is because he's told that there'll be work there. Instead, he's forced into indentured servitude, essentially slavery, right, in order to earn back his passage. But he takes it on with this kind of quiet, I need to do this for my mother, for my family. And all around him, he sees suffering, and all around him, he sees pain, and he internalizes that. In the very first couple of chapters, we see Purbhai being forced by the British colonialists to burn a village in order to lay the railway tracks. And that is a act that sticks with him for the rest of his life. Even though, the village, there was no one in the village at the time, he still burned it. And the title, I think, is quite apt there because what we see is throughout the tracking of this family through time, it's not just about, physical acts of burning, like the burning of a village. It's also about the fire that burns within us. Mm-hmm. And that fire can be transmitted through our families down the line.
All right. What is the third book on your list?
The third book is A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. And this is it's an incredible kind of plotless but engaging book in that we meet this man. His name is Count Rostov, and it's around 1917. And if you know anything about Russian history around them, the Bolsheviks were uprising and they took over the country. And men who were of the previous aristocracy were considered a threat to this new way of doing things. And so Count Rostov, because he was an aristocratic man, he was of letters, he was an elite, as we would say today, he is forced to live out the remaining days of his life inside the Hotel Metropole in Moscow. He's not allowed to leave it. And so he lives in this hotel starting in 1917 all the way through to the end of his days. And so what you get is a book that isn't very heavy on plot, because the book is basically about the people that he encounters, the other guests, the underworking machinations of how a hotel operates. And there's these American actresses that are coming to stay, and there's a lively kind of bar crowd. And so it's more, I think, a look at the manners and society of the time, which just kind of like Robert Seataller is a really interesting way of kind of revealing the entire life of a man. It's just super interesting to be stuck inside this hotel while the world around him, and Russia, which was the Soviet Union, which was embroiled again in wars and uprisings and the rise and fall of communism. And he's just watching it all happen from the window in Moscow.
As you say that he's stuck in the hotel, It occurs to me, this is a man stuck between more than that. It's old world and new world.
Absolutely.
And this theme of being caught between the old and the new, this runs through all these books.
Absolutely.
That you picked today. Why does that theme hold so much appeal for you?
I just love this idea that we never know that we are in the middle of history when we're sitting here. And I think that that is what permeates a lot of books that are set in the early part of the 20th century, is that nostalgic sensation that we are looking at a moment in time where everything was changing, but the people in those moments didn't realize it. And so you can kind of, as the reader, can see the things that the characters can't see.
Christine, thank you for these 3 recommendations and for sharing your joy about this time period.
Thank you so much for having me.
Christine Estima is the author of the Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society, and the books that she recommended today are on our website, cbc.ca/thenextchapter.